"You have 2 days to leave this house." My father said it without looking at me. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his back half turned, like he was addressing the wall and not his own daughter. 9 o'clock at night, January, sleet tapping against the bay window in a rhythm that sounded almost polite compared to what he had just said. My mother was beside him. She did not say a word. She did not have to. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and there was something in her expression I had never seen directed at me before. Not anger, exactly. Satisfaction. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator clicked along the baseboard, pushing out heat that smelled faintly of metal and old dust. I was still holding a dish towel from when I had been drying the last of the dinner plates, and I remember looking down at it like it was something that belonged to someone else. 2 days. I am Sophia. I am 28 years old. I am a kindergarten teacher, which means I have spent the last 6 years learning how to stay very still and very calm when the world around me is chaotic, because small children can sense fear the way dogs can, and the moment you flinch, you lose the room. I have walked into classrooms where 3 children were crying, one had glue in his hair, and someone had stacked every single chair into a tower in the corner, and I have not flinched. But standing in my parents' kitchen, in the house where I grew up, with sleet hitting the window and my father still not meeting my eyes, I felt something shift in my chest that I had no training for. My hand went to my pocket. There was a key on my keychain, an old brass one, heavy and slightly warm from being against my leg all day. I wrapped my fingers around it without thinking. 2 days. No explanation, no argument that I could counter, no list of grievances. Just a deadline handed to me like a parking ticket, and my mother watching to see how I would take it. I will tell you what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask why, though the question was sitting behind my teeth the whole time, because something told me that the why was not the point. The point, I realized as I stood there in my socked feet on the hardwood floor I had walked barefoot since I was 4 years old, was that they believed I would simply leave. They thought they had won before the game even started. I set the dish towel down on the counter, folded it once the way my mother had always asked me to, and said, "Okay." That was all I said. My father's shoulders relaxed. He was wrong to let them. If you want to know what I revealed, the thing they were actually afraid of, the thing that made my mother's hand shake when she finally understood, then stay right here. Because this story is not about being kicked out. It is about the moment I remembered something a dying man told me, and realized I had been sitting on more than I knew. Like this video, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because what happened 2 days later was something none of us saw coming. I got home at 4:15. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something had changed. There was a large wooden dresser sitting in the hallway outside my bedroom door, not pushed against the wall, not tucked to the side, placed directly in front of my door, angled so you would have to pivot around it to get the door open. A clear and deliberate placement. I stood and looked at it for a moment. It was Derek and Tara's dresser, the one that had been in what used to be the guest room at the end of the hall. They had moved it here, into my space, while I was at school. My mother was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving around. I called out, "Hi, Mom." She called back, "Hi," with a lightness that told me she knew what was in the hallway and had decided that lightness was the right register to take. I went upstairs, gripped the dresser on either side, and moved it. It was heavy, real wood, and my back complained, but I walked it step by step back down the hall to where it had been. Then I went into my room and closed my door. I sat on my bed for a moment with my coat still on. When I was in the classroom and a child was testing a boundary, not from cruelty, but from genuine curiosity about whether the rule was real, I would make my response very calm and very consistent. Not loud, not dramatic. Because what a child testing a boundary needs is to understand that the answer is the same every time, and that the answer does not depend on how the behavior is performed or escalated. What Derek and Tara were doing felt very much like that, and my mother's bright, unbothered voice downstairs told me they had her blessing. I took off my coat. I opened my laptop. I had an email from David Rains with a referral to a property attorney named Patricia Holloway, who had an office downtown and had already been briefed. Her assistant had sent a preliminary appointment for Friday. I replied to confirm. Then I went downstairs and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with a stack of unmarked art projects, and I started going through them one by one, writing small comments in the margins in my neatest handwriting. My mother stayed on the other side of the counter and did not speak to me. That was fine. I had stopped needing her to speak to me about 24 hours ago. I called my friend Mara that evening from my car, parked outside the house in the dark with the heat running, because I did not want anyone inside to hear me. Mara and I have been friends since college. She is the kind of person who leads with anger when she is worried about you, which sounds exhausting but is actually a form of love. She went through my explanation of the last 48 hours, the way a prosecutor goes through a timeline, asking sharp questions and making sounds of mounting outrage. "They moved furniture in front of your door," she said. "They moved it back," I said. "You moved it back." "Same thing." She made a sound. "Sophia, are you okay?" I thought about that honestly. The radiator smell in the house. The careful, diplomatic texture of my mother's voice. The way my father had looked tired that morning, and I had noticed it and felt something complicated that was probably still love despite everything. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm actually okay. That's what's strange." "Are you being calm in that way where you're actually falling apart and just not showing it yet?" "No," I said. "I'm being calm in the way where I know something they don't." She was quiet for a second. "What do you know?" So I told her about the deed, about David Rains, about Patricia Holloway and the Friday appointment. I told her about the second mortgage and what David had said about incomplete liens and the legal complications of financing a co-owned property without the co-owner's knowledge. By the time I finished, Mara was very quiet. Then she said, "What do you want to do with this?" It was such a direct question. I appreciated it more than I could say. "I don't want the house," I said immediately. That was true. Whatever had lived in me about that place, the morning light through the bay window, the way the third stair creaked, the oak tree in January ice, that thing had been replaced by something else in the last 2 days. You cannot burn a home down around someone and expect them to still want to live in it. "But I'm not going to let them push me out," I continued. "There's a difference between choosing to leave and being removed. I will not be removed." "Okay," Mara said. "I just need to know that I am the one who decides." "Okay," she said again, quieter this time, like she was settling the word into something. We talked for a little while longer, about nothing important, just the flat sound of a friend's voice in the dark. By the time we hung up, I was ready to go back inside. The family meeting was the next morning. I could feel it coming the way you can feel a weather change. I went in and went upstairs and went to sleep. They called it a family meeting. My mother used that exact phrase, knocking on my door Thursday morning. "We're having a family meeting in an hour, Sophia." As if I were 16 and had missed curfew. I said I would be there. The 4 of them were in the living room when I came downstairs. My father in the armchair, my mother on the love seat, Derek and Tara on the couch with the particular closeness of people who have decided to present as a unit. My father had actual papers in his hand, which I found almost touching in its theatricality. He had printed something. I sat in the other armchair and folded my hands in my lap. The key was in my left jacket pocket. I could feel the weight of it. My mother had clearly prepared the atmosphere the way she prepares for dinner guests. Everything arranged, the mood established before anyone walked in. There was a legal pad on the coffee table with some handwritten notes. My father looked at it occasionally as he started talking, like a man who had rehearsed and was checking himself against the script. He said they were giving me every consideration. He said the situation with the house had become complicated and necessary decisions had been made. He said Derek and his girlfriend needed stability and space to build their lives, and the house was the natural solution. He said I was young, I was capable, I had savings, I would be fine. He said all of this in the tone of someone granting a concession, not making a request. Then he picked up the legal pad and said, "We just need you to sign a letter confirming you'll be out by midnight tonight." My mother looked at me with that expression again, the careful one, the one that was waiting. Tara had a measuring tape on the cushion beside her. I noticed that. I let the room be quiet for 1 second. Just one. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, took out the key, and set it on the coffee table. Then I reached into my bag and took out the manila envelope and placed it beside the key. I said, "Before anyone signs anything, I think you should read what's in there." My father picked up the envelope the way you pick up something you do not recognize but think you should. He unfolded the document. He read the first line. Then he read it again. The room was so quiet I could hear the tick of the clock on the mantel, and Tara breathing, and the sound of my own heartbeat, which was very steady, remarkably steady, the way it gets when I have been awake in my classroom at 6 a.m, getting everything ready, and there is no one to perform for, and the work is just the work. My mother said, "What is that?" My father did not answer immediately. He turned the page. I watched the color leave his face the way color leaves a room when the sun goes behind clouds. Not a sudden change, a slow, even draining. He said, "This is a copy of the deed." "Yes," I said. "Your name is on this." "Yes." He looked up at me then. For the first time since Tuesday night, he actually looked at me, fully, the way fathers look at daughters when they have done something that requires recalibration. There was no satisfaction in it for me. I want to be honest about that. I had thought there might be, and there was not. There was just the quiet, complicated truth of two people who had loved each other for 28 years, sitting across a coffee table with something between them that could not be undone. My mother reached for the document. Her hands moved faster than I had expected, which told me everything about how worried she already was. I said quietly, "Grandpa put my name on the deed 2 years ago. That makes me a co-owner. I spoke with a real estate attorney yesterday." I kept my voice level and clear, the way I keep it when a student is upset and needs a calm anchor to hold on to. I cannot be asked to leave a property I co-own without a legal process. And when my father applied for the second mortgage on this property, the bank would have needed both owners' consent, or at least both owners' knowledge. The air in the room changed. My father's face went through something private and complicated. Derek said, "Wait." He looked at my father. "Did you know about this?" My father said nothing. That silence told me everything about what had been going on. He had not told the bank there was a co-owner. He had refinanced the house as though it were solely his. And now he understood what that could mean if I chose to make it one. I was not going to make it one, but he did not know that yet. And in that moment, sitting in the living room with the January light flat and gray through the bay window, that was the thing they had feared. Not me. Not the conflict. The consequence. The one they had created by assuming I did not matter enough to account for. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Tara got up quietly and went to the kitchen, which I thought was actually the wisest thing anyone in the room did. Derek sat very still. My mother had put the deed down on the coffee table beside the key and was looking at it the way people look at things they wish they had not seen, but cannot stop looking at. My father was staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had been confidently walking in one direction and just realized the road had changed under him. I did not push. I did not list everything they had gotten wrong. I did not talk about the 2 days or the dresser in the hall or the moving checklist my mother had written. I sat quietly in the armchair and let the room be however it needed to be. This was the thing teaching had given me that nothing else had. The knowledge that sometimes you do not need to speak to be heard. Sometimes you simply need to be present and steady and let the truth do the work. My father finally said, his voice low, "What do you want?" I had thought about this question the night before, in the car outside, after talking to Mara. I had a clear answer. I said, "I don't want the house. I never wanted the house." I looked at him directly. I wanted to be treated like I mattered in it. He did not reply to that, perhaps because there was nothing to say. I went on. What I want, specifically, is a formal buyout of my co-owner's share at fair market value. I want it done through attorneys, documented properly. And I want to be somewhere else by the time that process is complete, not because you told me to leave, but because I have decided to go. My mother looked up when I said that. Something moved across her face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief. Something in between. Derek said carefully, "What happens to the loan if—" "That's between Dad and his attorney," I said. "That's not my problem to solve." My father nodded once, slowly. He looked old to me suddenly. Not aged, exactly, just reduced. Like something that had been held in a particular shape for years and was now, all at once, released. I picked up the key from the coffee table and put it back in my pocket. I was not leaving it there. It was still mine. My father contacted his attorney before the end of the week. The process took about 6 weeks in total. Patricia Holloway, who was meticulous and reassuring in equal measure, walked me through each step. An appraisal was done. My share was calculated. There were some difficult conversations about the mortgage situation, none of which involved me directly, though I understood from a brief call with Patricia that my father's attorney was working quietly to address the disclosure issue with the bank before it became something larger. That was my father's problem to manage. I was not cruel about it. I was simply not involved. What I received at the end of the process was a wire transfer that was significantly more than I had saved in 2 years, which is the particular math of property values in a neighborhood that had spent 3 decades slowly gaining value, while my grandfather paid it off with 41 years of steady work. I did not gloat about any of it. Not to my parents, not really even to Mara, who would have understood and enjoyed it on my behalf. It did not feel like victory in the way I had imagined victory feeling as a child, triumphant and clean. It felt like the end of one version of things and the beginning of something else, still unmapped, still uncertain, but mine in a way nothing had felt mine in a long time. My mother called me the week after the papers were signed. The conversation was brief and careful. She said she hoped I was doing well. I said I was. She said she thought we might talk more later, when some time had passed. I said that sounded reasonable. There was a pause, and then she said, "Your grandfather loved you very much," which I think was the closest she could get, that day, to what she actually meant. I said, "I know he did. I loved him too." We hung up. I sat with my phone in my lap for a moment and let myself feel the whole complicated weight of that. The love and the loss and the strangeness of a family that had broken something and might or might not repair it. I did not push the feeling away. I did not tell myself to be fine. I let it be as heavy as it was, and then I got up and made tea. And by the time the kettle was done, I was already thinking about the apartment I was going to look at on Friday. It is spring now. I live in a third-floor walk-up on a street with old maples just beginning to go green. The apartment has exactly two things I fell in love with when I first walked through: a bay window that faces east and enough silence in the mornings that I can hear my own thinking. I bought a small potted olive tree and put it on the windowsill because I read somewhere that olive trees mean peace and stubbornness in equal measure, and I thought that was about right. I do not have an oak tree to look at anymore. I notice that sometimes. I will be sitting with my morning coffee, and something in the angle of the light will remind me of the kitchen at 14 Birchwood Lane, and I will feel a complicated little pull. Not grief exactly, but the specific ache of loving a place that stopped being safe. It passes. Things do. The old key hangs on a hook by my desk. It is the key to the house I co-owned without knowing it. The thing I had been carrying in my pocket for 3 years without understanding what it was. I hung it there, not as a reminder of the 2 days, or the dresser in the hallway, or my mother's face when she read the deed. I hung it there as a reminder of something quieter than that. A dying man who loved me looked at the life he was leaving behind and decided that I deserved a solid place in it. He did not tell me what he had done. He just did it and trusted that when I needed it, I would find it. I think about that more than I think about any of the rest of it. I am still a kindergarten teacher. I am still the person my students' parents trust to be steady when everything is loud. I still grade papers on Saturday mornings, now at the window with the olive tree and the maple light coming in. I am not healed in the way stories sometimes make healing sound, sudden and complete, like a fever breaking. I am healed the way real things heal, slowly, with scar tissue, with the knowledge that the scar means the wound is past. What I know now, more than anything else, there is a difference between the place that raised you and the place that holds you. I spent 28 years confusing them. I will not make that mistake again. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt true to something you have lived or are living right now, I would love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me. You do not have to have a story as dramatic as mine to share it. Sometimes just saying, "I understand this," is enough, and that matters more than you might think. If this video helped you or moved you even a little, please like it before you go. It takes 1 second and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might need to hear a story like this one. And if you are new here, please subscribe because there are many more of these coming. Stories about real people, real families, real moments where someone decided to stop underestimating themselves. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they do not have to be removed, that they can choose. I will see you in the next one. Take good care of yourself. Let me back up because you need to understand how I ended up in that kitchen in the first place. 2 years ago, my lease ran out on the apartment I had been renting on the east side of Columbus. My landlord raised the rent by $400, which put it well outside what I could afford on a teacher's salary, while also trying to save enough for a down payment on my own place. I was not failing, exactly. I was just stuck at that particular spot a lot of people in their mid-20s find themselves, where the math almost works but not quite, where you are too old to feel good about it and too young to give up. My parents offered me the guest room. My father said it casually over the phone, the way you offer someone a ride to the airport, and I said yes before I had time to think through what it would mean. I paid them $600 a month, which was fair for what I was using, and I contributed to groceries and kept my space clean and stayed out of their way as much as a person can when living in someone else's house. I had a plan. 18 months to save enough, maybe 24. I had a spreadsheet. The house is a 2-story colonial on a street with old oak trees and detached garages, the kind of neighborhood that was built for young families in the 1960s and has been slowly graying ever since. My parents have lived there for 31 years. I grew up in that house. I know every sound it makes. The way the third stair from the top creaks if you step on the left side. The way the kitchen heating vent rattles when the temperature drops below 20. The way the bay window in the living room lets in morning light in the winter at an angle that turns the whole room briefly golden for about 11 minutes before the sun moves. I love that house. That is the thing I need you to understand. I was not there out of carelessness. I was there because it was home, in the way that a place can be home even after you have been gone from it for years, even after you have built another version of your life somewhere else. There is a specific comfort in knowing where the light switches are without looking. I was not a burden. I was a daughter who was trying in a house that had always been safe, in a time when almost nothing else felt certain. I thought they understood that. I thought we had the same understanding of what was happening. I was wrong about that, but I would not know how wrong until those 3 words came out of my father's mouth, and my mother stood beside him like she had been waiting for that moment longer than I had known. What I also did not know, and this is the part that changes everything, is what my grandfather had quietly done before he died. But I am getting ahead of myself. The shift happened in October, about 3 months before the night of the ultimatum, though I did not recognize it as a shift at the time. I noticed individual moments, but did not connect them into a pattern until much later, and by then the pattern was already finished. My brother Derek came home. Derek is 25, 3 years younger than me, and he has always moved through the world with the particular ease of someone who has never quite been held accountable for his choices. Not because he is a bad person. He is charming and funny and can fix anything mechanical with his hands, which our father has always loved. But he is also the kind of person who disappears for months and then reappears at a family dinner expecting everyone to simply continue the conversation from wherever he left off, without any acknowledgement of the time in between. He came back from a job that had not worked out in Phoenix, and he brought his girlfriend Tara with him. Tara is thin and speaks quietly and has a habit of touching her own collarbone when she is nervous, and she was clearly trying hard to make a good impression, which I respected. She was perfectly pleasant, but she and Derek together occupied space in a different way than Derek alone. They needed a room. They needed to rearrange the bathroom schedule. They needed to store a second car in the driveway, which meant I had to park on the street. Small things, I told myself, normal adjustments. But then the dinners changed. My mother began making Derek's favorites on weeknights without comment. She would mention things Derek needed, small errands and favors, in the same breath she used to tell me about her day. My father and Derek started watching sports in the living room after dinner, the way they used to when we were kids, and the warmth between them was real and uncomplicated in a way that made me feel, some evenings, like a guest in a room where the other 2 people actually belonged. I reminded myself I was saving money. I reminded myself this was temporary. I graded papers at the kitchen table in the mornings and made my own dinners when I was working late and tried to be the kind of person who did not need much. I was good at that. Years of teaching had made me patient. I knew how to shrink. What I did not know was that shrinking was being read as permission. And underneath all of it, something was happening with the house. Something financial and deliberate that none of them were telling me about. The night of the ultimatum started ordinarily. I came home from school with a stack of art projects, the kind where 22 5-year-olds have each drawn what they want to be when they grow up, and half of them drew animals instead of professions, which I find both charming and philosophically significant. I made tea. I set the projects on the kitchen table to look through after dinner. My mother had made pot roast, which he does in January because the house smells like something safe when it is cold outside. Derek and Tara were at the table when I sat down. My father was already eating. Normal, I thought. Ordinary Tuesday. Somewhere in the middle of it, in the way conversations drift, someone mentioned the refinancing. Not deliberately. I do not think anyone planned for me to hear it. My father and Derek were talking about the house, whether to replace the back fence, and my father mentioned something about the loan coming through, and Derek said something about the timeline. I was not really listening until my father said the phrase second mortgage, and something in my brain flagged it. I looked up. "You took out a second mortgage?" The table went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of a normal pause. The quiet of people deciding how much to say. My father said it was nothing I needed to worry about. My mother changed the subject to the fence. Derek looked at his plate. I did not press. I am a teacher. I know when a room has decided not to engage with a topic, and I know that pushing into that kind of refusal only makes people more defensive and less honest. So I finished my dinner, and I cleared my plate, and I started washing the pot roast pan. And then my father came to stand at the counter and said the words that rearranged everything. "We've made some decisions about the house. You have 2 days to leave." I kept washing the pan for 1 full second after he finished speaking. Then I turned off the water. My mother materialized beside him. They had rehearsed this, I realized. The placement, the timing, the unified front. What neither of them had rehearsed, because neither of them knew about it, was what was sitting in a box on the shelf in my closet, under a stack of old picture frames and a cross stitch my grandmother had made that I could never bring myself to throw out. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I folded it. I said, "Okay," and I went upstairs. I did not sleep that night, not even close. I lay in my childhood bedroom with the sleet still going against the window and the radiator hissing and clicking and doing that thing it does in January, where it smells faintly burned for the first hour, like the heat is working too hard. And I stared at the water stain on the ceiling that has been there since I was 11, and my father always said he would get around to fixing it. He never did. I kept thinking about the second mortgage. The way my father's jaw had tightened when I asked. The way my mother changed the subject so fast it was almost athletic. Derek and Tara, who had been there less than 3 months, now knew something about this house's finances that I did not. That was not an accident. My brain went through the possibilities the way you do at 2 a.m. when you cannot stop it. Maybe they needed money, and it was embarrassing. Maybe the refinancing was routine and I had misread the tension. Maybe Derek was going to be given the house someday and they needed me gone to start that process cleanly. Any of those things would be hurtful, but they would be survivable. I could find an apartment. I had the savings. It would set me back 6 months, maybe 8, but I could do it. What I could not make sense of was the urgency. 2 days was not a transition plan. 2 days was removal. And the look on my mother's face, that careful, held satisfaction, told me this had been coming for longer than tonight. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to the window. The bare oak in the front yard was glassed with ice, each branch lit faintly by the streetlight. It looked the way things look when they are beautiful and you know you are about to lose them. And that is when my grandfather's voice came into my head. Not a memory of a whole conversation, just one sentence, said one afternoon 2 years before, when he was already sick and we both knew it. He said, "This house will always have a place for you, Sophia." I made sure of it. I had thanked him and assumed it was the sentiment of a man who loved me and was frightened of dying. I had not thought about it more than that. But now, Standing at the window at 3 in the morning with 45 hours left on my parents' countdown, I thought about it for the first time with real attention. He said he had made sure of it. He was not a man who spoke loosely. I turned away from the window and went to my closet. My grandfather's name was Harold James Harmon. He was 79 years old when he died, and he had worked for the same sheet metal company for 41 years and never once complained about it, which is the kind of thing that sounds ordinary until you understand that he had planned, saved, and sacrificed with a precision that most people apply only to things they love. He loved his family with that same precision. He bought this house in 1982 for my grandparents, paid it off by the time my father was 30, and then signed the deed over to my father when my parents married. That was how much he believed in the idea of family as something you build on solid ground and then hand forward. 2 years ago, when he was in the hospital and it was clear he was not coming back from it, I visited every day I could. We watched old westerns on the room television, and I brought him salted peanuts in a paper bag because it was the one thing he said tasted right in that building. On one of those afternoons, he asked me to hand him the remote, and then he said it without preamble, the way he said most things. I had the attorney add your name to the deed, yours and your father's, both. This house will always have a place for you. I said, Grandpa, you did not have to do that. He said, No, I did not have to. That is how you know it means something. I think I cried a little. I think I changed the subject because I was not ready to hold that much tenderness without falling apart. A few weeks later, he was gone, and in the grief of those months, I had thought about his words as something beautiful and emotional, a declaration of love from a man who said very little but felt everything. I had not thought of it as a legal document. Now, standing in my closet at 3 in the morning, I was thinking about it as a legal document. The box was on the top shelf behind an old Halloween costume and 2 shoe boxes of photographs I had been meaning to organize. I pulled it down and sat on the floor with it in my lap and started going through papers by the light of my phone. Letters, tax forms from college, my old car insurance, and then, near the bottom, a manila envelope with my grandfather's law firm's return address in the upper left corner. Inside was a copy of the deed to the house at 14 Birchwood Lane, and on the line below my father's name, in clean black print, were the words, Sophia Claire Harmon, co-owner. I sat on the floor of my closet and read it 3 times. Then I turned the key over in my hand, the old brass one I had been carrying without knowing why, and I understood. I stayed on the floor for a long time. The cold from the hardwood came through my pajama pants, and the house was making all its usual night sounds around me. The radiator, the occasional creak of settling, the sleet finally thinning to silence somewhere past 4 in the morning. I held the deed in both hands and thought with a clarity I almost never have at that hour. What I knew? My name was on this deed. What that meant legally, I was not entirely sure. I remembered something vague from a conversation years ago, something about co-ownership and what it required to sell or transfer property. But I was not a lawyer. I was a kindergarten teacher sitting on a closet floor in January, and I needed someone who knew the law to tell me what I was actually holding. What I also knew, in a layer beneath the legal facts, was this. My father had taken out a second mortgage on this house. A house that did not have a single owner. A house where someone else's name was on the deed. All the pieces were sitting right in front of me. I photographed the deed with my phone. I photographed both pages twice, making sure the text was clear, my name visible. Then I put the original back in the envelope, put the envelope in the box, and put the box in my tote bag, where I would know exactly where it was. I did not sleep after that. I lay on my bed with the lights off and made a list in my head of what to do in the morning, the way I make lesson plans, methodically, one step at a time. By the time gray winter light started coming through the curtains, I had a very clear idea of what the next 24 hours needed to look like. My parents gave me 2 days. I was going to use both of them, not to pack. The morning of day 2 was a Wednesday. I had school. I was up before my alarm, showered, dressed, and downstairs with coffee before anyone else was moving. The house was quiet in that particular winter morning way, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, like the air has not decided yet what kind of day it is going to be. I stood at the kitchen counter and drank my coffee and looked out the bay window at the oak tree, which was still glassed with ice from the night before, catching the pale early light in ways that made each branch look lit from within. I had done a lot of things in my life while standing at that window. Eaten cereal before school, cried after a bad breakup at 24, graded papers on Saturday mornings with the radio on low. It was the most ordinary spot in the world, and I loved it in a specific and physical way. The way you love places that have absorbed your life for long enough that you are part of them, whether you chose it or not. My father came downstairs around 7. He saw me at the counter, and there was a brief, assessing pause before he said neutrally, "Making arrangements?" I looked at him over my coffee mug. He was 61 years old, and he looked tired, which I noticed and filed away. I said, "I'm going to school." He blinked. "We need to talk about the timeline." "I'll be back by 4, I said. I rinsed my mug, set it in the drying rack, picked up my bag and my keys. "Have a good morning, Dad." I heard Tara's voice from upstairs, something about measurements. I let myself out the front door. My car was parked on the street because of hers. I sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, the cold hard and immediate, my breath making small clouds. I had a full day of teaching ahead of me, 22 5-year-olds who needed someone entirely present, and then whatever the afternoon would bring. I texted one person from the car before I pulled away, a parent of one of my students, a real estate attorney named David Rains, whom I had met at a school fundraiser in November, and who had given me his card in that casual, professional way people do when they want you to know the offer is genuine. I wrote, "Hi, David. I have an unusual legal question about property co-ownership. Would you have 15 minutes today? No rush if not." He replied before I reached the first stoplight, "Call me at noon. I'll make time." I called David Rains from the parking lot behind the school during my lunch break, sitting in my car with the heat running and a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat. I had the photos of the deed pulled up on my phone, and I described the situation as accurately and concisely as I could, the way I have learned to communicate with people who are busy and smart and doing me a favor. No drama, just facts. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then he said, "Sophia, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Your name is on the deed as a co-owner, and your father has taken out a second mortgage on the property without your knowledge or consent?" "That's what it appears," I said. "I don't know the exact conditions of the loan." He was quiet for another moment. "Okay, I want to be careful here because I am not your attorney and this is not formal legal advice, but as a general matter, here is what you need to understand." He explained it slowly, which I appreciated. Property held in joint ownership, what the law sometimes calls tenancy in common, cannot simply be mortgaged by one owner without the other's knowledge or consent, without potentially creating complications with the lender. When a bank issues a second mortgage, they need to ensure they have a clear claim against the entire property. If the deed lists 2 owners and only one signed the mortgage documents, the lender may have an incomplete lien. In plain terms, if someone had not disclosed the full ownership situation to the bank, there was a problem with that loan that had nothing to do with me. He also said, more gently, "You cannot be asked to vacate a property you co-own without a legal process. An informal 2-day notice from your father has no legal standing whatsoever." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a minivan pulled into the parking lot, and a teacher I recognized got out and walked toward the building without looking up from her phone. "Thank you," I said. "Sophia?" His voice shifted slightly, became more direct. "I'd like to recommend you speak with a property attorney before you do anything else. Specifically, someone who can look at the actual deed, the mortgage documents, and advise you formally. Do you want me to make a call?" "Yes," I said. "Please." I sat in the parking lot for a few more minutes after we hung up. The sandwich had gone cold. I ate half of it anyway. Then I went back inside because 22 5-year-olds were finishing their rest time and they were going to need someone steady and present for the afternoon. I could do that. I was very good at being steady when it mattered. The thing about Derek that I never quite knew how to articulate, even to myself, was that he was genuinely likable. That was the complicated part. If he had been difficult or unkind, the whole situation would have been straightforward. I would have had a villain and a clear narrative. But Derek was warm, in the easy, unthinking way of people who have never had to work hard for warmth because it has always come naturally to them. He told jokes that landed. He helped with dishes when he felt like it. He called our mother by a nickname she visibly loved and could never quite suppress her pleasure at hearing. He was, in some essential way, the child she had always found less effort to love. I do not think this was something she decided consciously. I do not think she sat down one day and chose Derek. Families do not work that way. What happened was more like erosion. 1,000 small moments accumulated over years, each one individually harmless, until one day the shape of the land was different from what it used to be, and you could not point to the exact moment it changed. I had figured this out a long time before the night of the ultimatum. I was probably 14 or 15 the first time I understood, without having the language for it yet, that Derek and I inhabited slightly different versions of our family. Not cruel versions, just different. His failures were absorbed more readily. His presence generated more warmth. There is a particular kind of loneliness in loving a family that has a favorite and being the one who is not the favorite and knowing that nothing you do will change the underlying math of it. You either leave yourself or you learn to be content with what there is. I had mostly chosen the second option. I had made my peace with it in the way you make peace with a fact you cannot change. By deciding that the fact was smaller than everything else that was true, that my family had enough love for all of us even if it was not apportioned evenly, that love never was in anyone's family, perfectly equal. What I had not factored in was what happens when scarcity enters the picture. When there is something finite to divide, a house, a plan, a future, and someone has to decide who gets the larger share. That was when all the accumulated small choices became something with consequence. Tara was harder for me to read than Derek. She was quietly strategic in a way that was almost admirable, and I could see why Derek had chosen her and why she had agreed to be chosen. She wanted stability the way some people want air. She had attached herself to the most plausible version of stability available to her, which was Derek in a house that his parents owned, and she was protecting that with the careful, relentless energy of someone who has not always had solid ground under her feet. I had some sympathy for this. I even had some respect for it. What I could not have was patience for the fact that the ground she was seeking to stand on was ground where I also stood. She and I never had a direct conversation about any of it. We were pleasant to each other in the hallway and distant in the kitchen and very careful at the dinner table to avoid the kinds of eye contact that require honesty. I do not know what she thought of me. I suspect she thought of me mostly as an obstacle that was taking longer to remove than expected. She was right that I was taking longer to remove. She was wrong about why. What nobody in that house understood, including me for most of those first 48 hours, was that my presence was not a temporary inconvenience to be managed. It was a legal fact, registered with the county, filed with a dead man's care and foresight, sitting in a manila envelope in a box under a stack of old photographs, waiting for the moment someone needed to take it seriously. I had always thought of my grandfather Harold as a man of few words. That was accurate. He did not explain himself often, did not offer justifications, or ask for acknowledgement. He simply moved through the world with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided what mattered and was spending his remaining time on those things, and not the others. When he told me what he had done, the day in the hospital with the salted peanuts and the old Western on the small screen, I understood that he was not asking me to respond or to thank him adequately. He was simply informing me of a fact, one that he trusted I would carry and use when I needed it. He knew me well enough to know that I would need it eventually, that something in my family's particular gravity would at some point require a counterweight. He could not have known exactly what form it would take. He just knew. I find that I think about that more than anything else from this whole story, more than the meeting in the living room, more than my father's face when he read the page. What stays with me is the image of Harold James Harmon, 79 years old and 2 weeks from the end of his life, calling his attorney and saying, "Put her name on it, because she will need it and she will not think to ask." That is a specific kind of love, the kind that thinks ahead, the kind that trusts you even before you have given it reason to. I feel, when I think about it, something that is too large to name and too important to reduce to something smaller. I carry it. The weekend after the family meeting, while the legal process was still being arranged and I was still technically living in my childhood bedroom, I went through my things. Not packing in defeat, packing in preparation for something entirely different. I folded clothes I had owned for years. I went through a box of objects from college and made decisions about what still had a place in my future. I found a photograph of Harold and me at a birthday party when I was 8, both of us laughing at something outside the frame, and I put it in the keep pile without hesitation. The school term was still running. Each morning I drove to work and spent 6 hours in a room with 22 children who needed someone steady, and I was that. I was very good at that. My assistant teacher, a young woman named Brianna, who had 3 months left in her practice placement, commented once that week that I seemed particularly calm, and I said, "Thank you," and left it at that. There is a skill in appearing unchanged when everything beneath the surface is in motion. It is not deception. It is management. It is the ability to hold two things at once: the immediate situation, which requires presence and reliability, and the larger situation, which requires planning and patience. I had been developing that skill since childhood. In the context of my family, it had sometimes felt like survival. In the context of the classroom, it felt like a vocation. What teaching had given me, the years of it, the specific daily practice of staying calm when things are loud and staying patient when children are difficult and staying present when every instinct says to step back, was not just professional competence. It was a way of being, a muscle trained until it held without effort. And in the week that my family revealed what they had decided and I decided what to do about it, that muscle was the thing that made the difference. Not the deed, not the attorney, the habit of steadiness. The deed and the attorney provided the ground. The steadiness was how I walked on it without stumbling. I moved out on a Saturday in late January, 2.5 weeks after the family meeting. Mara came with her car and we made 3 trips. My father was not home. My mother was, and she stood in the kitchen while I carried boxes through the front hall. And once she said something about the box with the cast iron pan that I think was meant as a question about whether it belonged to the house. And I said quietly, "It's mine, Mom. It was a birthday gift." And she said, "Right, of course," and was very still for the rest of it. I did not say a proper goodbye. Not that day. There was nothing yet to say that would have been complete enough or careful enough, and I have learned that it is better to say nothing than to say something that lands wrong at the wrong moment. The things that needed to be said would either find their time or they would not. When the last box was loaded, I stood on the front porch for a moment. The oak tree was still glacial from the most recent freeze, though the ice had thinned. The bare branches made their complicated pattern against a pale February sky. I had spent 28 years looking at that tree. I took a last long look and let it be what it was. Something I had loved, that I was leaving, that would still be there without me. Then I got in Mara's car. I did not look back as we pulled away. Not because the past did not mean anything, because it meant exactly what it was supposed to, and I was ready for what came next. There are things you only understand about a family after you have left it. Not because you are smarter or more objective from a distance, though that helps, but because when you are inside a family, you are inside its logic too. The rules of it feel like the rules of the world. The things that are never said feel like they are not said for a reason, and you trust that reason even when you do not know what it is. When I was living in that house, I understood my family the way you understand a room you have always been in, by feel, by habit, without needing to see it clearly. My father's silences meant a dozen different things depending on the day. My mother's warmth had a temperature that varied with circumstances I had learned to read over 28 years. Derek's absence and presence both followed a pattern I could have drawn blind. What I did not understand from inside the logic of that family was how much of that I had absorbed as permanent fact. The fact that my father made the decisions. The fact that my mother managed the atmosphere. The fact that Derek was forgiven in ways I was not, and that I had long ago stopped expecting to be forgiven in those ways, and that this stopping had been so gradual I had not noticed it happened. The fact that my presence in that house was conditioned on my being useful and quiet and not complicating anything. I had agreed to all of these things without being asked. That is how family logic works. You agree to it without being asked, because it was already established when you arrived, and you were too young then to negotiate. What the 2 days forced, more than anything else, was clarity. When my father said you have 2 days, he was invoking the logic of the family as he understood it. He was the decision maker. I was the one who adapted. The math was simple. What he had not accounted for was that I was 28 years old, that I had built a professional life around a different logic entirely, that I had spent 6 years in a room with children and learned a different grammar of power, one that was quieter and slower and more patient than the grammar I grew up with, but ultimately more solid. And he had not accounted for Harold. I have thought about what my grandfather understood that my father did not. I think Harold watched our family with the eyes of someone who had built it from the outside, who had come to it as a parent-in-law rather than as a son, and who therefore could see its tilts and preferences and small injustices more clearly than those inside it could. He watched for over 30 years. He drew his conclusions quietly and acted on them in the way he acted on everything, deliberately, practically, without drama. He put my name on the deed, not because he thought I needed protecting from my family. He put my name on it because he understood that love and fairness are related, but not identical, and that fairness sometimes requires a mechanism when love alone is not enough. He was right. I did not know he was right until I needed him to be. There is a kind of grief in that realization, a gratitude so large it aches slightly. I have sat with it often since January in the new apartment with the olive tree on the windowsill, trying to find a way to hold it that does not overwhelm me. What I have arrived at is this. I carry him with me the way you carry the places and people that shape the best parts of you, not as a weight, but as a foundation. Something underneath that holds when the surface shifts. The key still hangs by my desk. Some mornings I look at it and remember the closet floor in January, the cold through my pajama pants, the clarity that arrived at 3 a.m. in a house that was trying to push me out. I am glad I stayed long enough to find it. I am glad I left when I chose to. Both of those things are true, and they do not contradict each other. That, I think, is the thing I want most to say. You can love a place and leave it. You can love a family and hold them accountable. You can be soft and still be immovable. These things look like contradictions from the outside, but from the inside. From inside the life of someone who has learned them slowly and with difficulty, they are simply the truth. Sophia Claire Harmon, 28 years old, kindergarten teacher, co-owner of a house she no longer lives in and does not want, standing in her new apartment in spring light, holding a cup of tea and looking at the olive tree and thinking about her grandfather. That is where this story ends, with gratitude and a key on a hook and a woman who knows finally exactly what she is worth.